Somewhere in the western Pyrenees, straddling the border between Spain and France, there is a language being spoken today that has no known relatives anywhere on Earth. Not one. Every other language in Europe belongs to a family. They share ancestors, swap grammar, echo one another across centuries of migration and conquest. This one belongs to none of it. It never has. For generations, linguists circled the language, pulling at its edges, searching for the single thread that would tie it to something familiar. They never found it. Then ancient DNA changed the question entirely. It did not survive by accident. It did not survive where anyone thought to look. And what the genome finally revealed is stranger than mere survival. But to understand what the DNA overturned, you first have to understand what this language actually is and why it was never supposed to exist at all. Stand anywhere in the Basque country and listen. To the west, Spanish. To the east, French. Cross the border in any direction and you find Romance languages, descendants of Latin, cousins of one another, part of the vast Indo-European family that stretches from Portugal all the way to the Indian subcontinent. Then come back, because what you hear in the Basque country belongs to none of that. It never did. The language, known to its speakers as Euskara, is what linguists call a language isolate. The term sounds technical, but its meaning is simple and staggering. It means the language has no known relatives. No parent, no sisters, no distant cousins buried in some overlooked corner of the record. Every attempt to connect it to another family has failed. It stands entirely alone, surrounded on all sides by languages it shares nothing fundamental with. This is not supposed to happen. Languages do not exist in isolation. They borrow, they merge, they evolve from shared ancestors. The entire discipline of historical linguistics is built on a single principle, that languages are related, that if you go back far enough, you find the common root. With Basque, you go back as far as the evidence allows, and the root simply disappears into the prehistoric dark. Look at the place itself, and the strangeness only deepens. The Basque country sits in the westernmost stretch of the Pyrenees, a compact region of forested mountains and Atlantic coastline spanning the border between northern Spain and southwestern France. It is not a large territory. Yet the language spoken there is unlike anything else on the continent. Around 714,000 people speak it as a native tongue today, roughly 663,000 on the Spanish side, and just over 51,000 on the French side. That is close to 27% of the total Basque population, a minority within a minority. The politics sharpen the picture further. The language holds official status in Spain's Basque autonomous community and in parts of Navarre. In France, it holds no official recognition at all. It exists, in other words, on the margins of two modern nation-states, surviving in a world that was never designed with it in mind. But here is what sets the Basque case apart from every other linguistic mystery on Earth. This is not a language recently torn from its family by some historical accident, a survivor of a known parent that died within reach of memory. This is a language that appears to have stood alone for an extraordinarily long time, possibly since before the world as we know it began to take shape. And a thing that old, that isolated, that stubbornly itself, raises a question that historians could not answer with the tools they had. How does a language like this survive for so long? And where on earth did it come from in the first place? The answers, it turned out, were not waiting in ancient texts. They were buried in ancient bones. Before the laboratories got involved, historians and linguists had only one tool, the written record. And the written record, when it comes to this language, runs out fast. What scholars could establish with confidence is this. Basque descends from an older language called Aquitanian, spoken across the Pyrenees during the Roman era, We know it from inscriptions, the names of people and deities carved into stone across what is now southern France and northern Spain. Those names share recognizable roots with modern Basque words. The connection is solid. Aquitanian is the ancestor. That much is not in dispute. But Aquitanian itself is a dead end. Follow it backward, and the trail goes cold. Where did Aquitanian come from? What family did it belong to before Roman expansion began absorbing everything around it? Nobody knows. The stone inscriptions stop, and beyond them, there is only silence. Into that silence, theories rushed. The most persistent is the Vasconic hypothesis, argued by the German linguist Theo Vennemann, which proposes that Aquitanian was not a lone survivor, but the remnant of a vast pre-Indo-European family that once covered most of Western Europe. On this reading, before the Indo-European languages swept across the continent, something called Vasconic was spoken from the Atlantic coast deep into Central Europe. Basque is not an anomaly at all. It is the last living fragment of a world almost entirely erased. It is a compelling theory. It is also unproven. Others pointed instead to the ancient Iberian language spoken along the Mediterranean coast of Spain. The similarities to Basque are real. But here the linguists turn cautious, and the caution matters. Similarities between neighboring languages can come from centuries of contact and borrowing rather than genuine shared ancestry. Two tongues spoken side by side will trade words and habits without ever having descended from the same root. The debate has never been settled. Some went further still, drawing speculative lines between Basque and the Caucasian languages of Georgia and Armenia, non-Indo-European tongues on the far side of Europe. The structural echoes are intriguing, but intriguing is not the same as proven, and that connection remains firmly in the realm of theory. Meanwhile, the Basque people themselves were living through a history that offered its own quiet clues. For centuries, their mountain terrain worked as a natural barrier, holding invaders and outside influence at arm's length. Latin came in, as it did everywhere, and left its mark on Basque vocabulary. Romance languages borrowed and were borrowed from across the medieval centuries, but the core of the language held. Then, in 1939, came Francisco Franco, whose regime banned Basque from schools, from public life, from the media, and a generation grew up cut off from its own tongue. The old theories could explain none of it. Not the survival, not the isolation, not the sheer impossible age of the thing. Linguistics had reached the end of what it could do alone. And then a completely different science arrived, and it did not come empty-handed. The new science had a name that sounds like exactly what it is: ancient DNA analysis. Researchers extract genetic material from the skeletal remains of people who died hundreds or thousands of years ago, sequence it, and compare it against other ancient and modern genomes. From that comparison, they reconstruct who those people were, where they came from, and how they relate to the populations living today. It is, in every meaningful sense, a biological time machine. And when researchers turned it toward the question of Basque origins, the results were extraordinary. The work that cracked it came from a team led by the geneticists Torsten Günther and Matthias Jakobsen at Uppsala University, who in 2015 sequenced the genomes of ancient farmers recovered from a cave at Atapuerca in northern Spain and set them against modern populations. The core finding can be stated simply, even though the science behind it is anything but. The Basque people are not a mysterious anomaly who appeared from nowhere. They are the direct descendants of two ancient populations that layered on top of each other in Iberia across thousands of years. The first were the original Western European hunter-gatherers, people who had lived across the continent since the last ice age, long before farming existed. The second were early farmers who migrated into Europe from Anatolia, the region we now call Turkey, beginning around 8,000 years ago. These two groups met. They mixed. They settled across the Iberian Peninsula, as they did in many other corners of Europe. There was nothing unique in the meeting itself. What came next is where the Basque story breaks away from everyone else's. In the region around the Western Pyrenees, something happened that did not happen, to the same degree, almost anywhere else on the continent. The mixing stopped. The population settled into itself. And then, for a very long time, they were left alone. That isolation is the key to everything that follows. While the rest of Europe kept shifting and churning, wave after wave of people moving through, mixing, overwriting what came before, the communities in and around the Pyrenees experienced far less of that disruption. Their genetic profile stabilized. And here is the part that reframes the entire mystery. Their language stabilized with it. The Basque tongue did not survive because it was somehow uniquely tough, or because the mountains alone shielded it, though the mountains would matter a great deal. It survived because the people who carried it were themselves a surviving population. A population that had been rooted in that one region, in various forms, for an extraordinarily long time, possibly as far back as 10,000 years. That number deserves a moment of stillness. 10,000 years. While empires rose and fell, while languages swept across continents and vanished again, while the entire known world transformed beyond recognition, something in the Pyrenees held. But the genetics were not finished, because the same data revealed something far more specific about how that survival was actually possible. And it came down to a single migration that reshaped everything around it. Around 5,000 years ago, something dramatic happened to Europe. A population of nomadic herders from the Pontic steppe, the vast grasslands stretching north of the Black Sea, began moving westward in enormous numbers. These were the Yamnaya, and they did not simply migrate. They remade the continent. The genetic scale of that movement was mapped in 2015 by two teams working in parallel, one led by David Reich at Harvard, the other by Eske Willerslev in Copenhagen. And what they found was a near total rewrite. Within a few thousand years, the Yamnaya and their descendants had spread their genes, their culture, and their languages across most of Europe. The Indo-European family, which today includes English, Spanish, French, German, Russian, and dozens of others, almost certainly traces back to that single expansion. Wherever the steppe people went, the populations already living there were absorbed, displaced, or genetically overwhelmed. The hunter-gatherers and early farmers who had built Europe's first societies left behind their monuments of stone, but their languages, with one extraordinary exception, vanished entirely. That exception was the Basque region. Ancient DNA studies comparing modern Basques against their Spanish and French neighbors produced a finding as clear as it is remarkable. Modern Basques carry significantly lower levels of Yamnaya steppe ancestry than virtually any other population in Western Europe. The genetic signal of that massive Bronze Age migration, the wave that reshaped almost everyone else on the continent, is present in the Basque genome, but it is muted, reduced, as if the wave broke against the Pyrenees and lost most of its force before it could penetrate fully. This is not an interesting footnote. It is the biological explanation for the linguistic survival, and it is the real answer the title promised. Because there is a pattern that holds across human history with brutal consistency. When a population is absorbed into a larger incoming group, it adopts the language of that group, usually within a few generations. The old tongue is set down and not picked up again. It has happened over and over on every continent. But when a population keeps its genetic continuity, it tends to keep its linguistic continuity along with it. The two travel together, and the Basque region did both at once. So the picture inverts. The mystery was never why one stubborn language clung on against the odds. The language held because the people held. The genes and the grammar were carried by the same hands through the same valleys across the same impossible stretch of time, and the geography made it possible. The Pyrenees are not a scenic backdrop. They are one of the most formidable natural barriers in Europe, a wall of peaks and deep valleys that channeled migration around the Basque heartland rather than through it. The steppe migrants who flooded the rest of the continent found easier roads elsewhere. The Pyrenean communities were not untouched, but they were touched far less than almost anywhere else. And what survived as a result was not simply a language, it was a window. The genetic evidence tells us who the Basque people are and where they came from, but the language has been carrying the very same message all along, quietly, for 10,000 years. You only have to know how to read it. Start with the structure. Basque is what linguists call an ergative absolutive language, and that means it divides a sentence differently from anything in the Indo-European family. In English, and in every Indo-European tongue, the subject is treated the same way whether or not the verb acts on anything else. The man walked. The man saw the child. In both, the man is the subject, and the grammar handles him identically. Basque does not work that way. There, the noun changes its form depending on whether the action it performs reaches out and affects something else. The man who sees the child takes a different marker from the man who simply falls. That marker, a hard case ending fixed to the noun, is called the ergative case. It has no equivalent in any surrounding language. It belongs to a different grammatical universe entirely. This is not a quirk. It is a structural fossil. Ergative languages do exist elsewhere in the world, in the Caucasus, in parts of South Asia, in certain indigenous languages of the Americas. But in Western Europe, Basque stands alone. Its grammar is the grammar of a world that came before the Indo-European expansion, a world whose other languages were swallowed so completely that not even their structures survived. Except here. Look further, and the evidence only deepens. Basque is agglutinative, which means it builds meaning by stacking suffixes onto a root rather than using separate words or reshaping the root itself. The definite article is not a small word set before the noun, as in English or French. It is a suffix, fastened to the end. The entire architecture of the language, the way it assembles meaning, the way it marks the relationships between words, runs on a logic with no Indo-European equivalent anywhere. And yet the vocabulary tells a different story. Basque is full of Latin borrowings, romance, loanwords absorbed across centuries of contact, with the world pressing in around it. The word for book, liburu, is recognizably Latin. Dozens of everyday words carry the fingerprints of languages that arrived long after Basque was already ancient. This is the honest part of the picture. The vocabulary adapted, it bent to the centuries. But the skeleton never did. The grammar, the deep structure, the bones of the thing, held firm while the words came and went around it. That skeleton is now preserved in a standardized written form called Euskara Batua, developed in the 1960s to bridge the 5 main dialects and give the language a single unified shape. It was an act of deliberate rescue. Because what is preserved in that grammar is not merely a linguistic curiosity, not a museum piece to be admired and filed away. It is the last living record of how a whole vanished Europe once thought. And that record, astonishingly, is still in daily use. The science is settled, the mystery is solved, and yet the language that unlocked 10,000 years of human history is still fighting for its life. Today, only around 27% of people in the Basque country speak Euskara. In a region of nearly 3 million people, that means roughly 2 million have grown up without access to the very thing that makes their culture irreplaceable. And that is not an accident of history. It is the direct consequence of a deliberate campaign to destroy it. Franco's suppression of the language beginning in 1939 did not kill Euskara, but it came closer than anything the previous 10 millennia had managed. An entire generation was severed from the tongue, in schools, in public spaces, in the media. The silence that followed was not natural. It was engineered from above, on purpose. When Franco's grip began to loosen in the 1960s, the recovery effort started. Basque language schools, known as ikastolak, began operating again. The standardized form, Euskara Batua, was developed by the Basque Language Academy to give the fractured dialects a common written shape and a shared future. Regional governments on the Spanish side began promoting the language actively, funding education, supporting Basque media, embedding it in public institutions. The results have been real. Speaker numbers have stabilized, and in some places, among younger generations, they have grown. In the Basque autonomous community, fluency rates run meaningfully higher than the regional average. But recovery is not the same as security, and honesty demands the distinction be drawn plainly. On the French side of the border, Euskara holds no official status whatsoever. There are no government-funded immersion programs, no legal protections, no institutional support comparable to what exists in Spain. The 51,000 French Basque speakers are, in large part, on their own. And language loss does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a ban or a decree. It happens quietly, one generation at a time, as children grow up choosing the language of wider opportunity over the language of their grandparents. A tongue that survived 10,000 years can still slip away inside a single century, almost without anyone deciding that it should. And the stakes reach far beyond the mountains. If Euskara disappears, humanity does not simply lose a regional dialect or a local variation of something larger. It loses the sole surviving voice of a linguistic world that once stretched across pre-Indo-European Europe. Every grammar textbook, every ancient DNA study, every carefully excavated Pyrenean site can tell us what that vanished world looked like from the outside. Only Euskara can speak it from within. That is the strange weight this language now carries. It is at once one of the oldest things in Europe and one of the most fragile, a survivor of the Yamnaya of Rome of Franco, still standing, still spoken, but no longer guaranteed its next 100 years. The genome explained how it lasted so long. Whether it lasts much longer is no longer a question for science. It is a question for the living. 10,000 years is an almost impossible number to hold in the mind. Empires that felt permanent dissolved within centuries. Languages that once ruled continents are known today only to specialists. And yet, in a compact stretch of mountains between Spain and France, something endured. Not because power protected it, not because prestige or the machinery of any state stood behind it, but because the people who carried it, genetically and culturally, simply never fully let go. The DNA findings did not demystify this language. They made it more astonishing, because now we know that what survived in the Pyrenees is no curiosity and no accident. It is the last living echo of a world that existed before the world we know began. A grammatical memory reaching back to the Stone Age, still spoken, still taught, still argued over in mountain villages and city apartments alike. The question was never where Euskara came from. The question is whether we deserve to keep it.